Welcome, dear viewers, to a journey back in time, long before the name Hannibal struck fear into the heart of Rome. Today, we explore Carthage before Hannibal, the story of a city that rose from the sea to dominate the Mediterranean, centuries before its most famous general was even born. Our voyage begins in the mists of the 12th century BCE, when Phoenician sailors, driven by trade and exploration, planted a settlement on the North African coast. We will walk through bustling harbors filled with exotic goods, follow the rise of merchant kings, and witness the diplomatic brilliance that made Carthage a hub of power and wealth. We'll see its temples rise, its fleets conquer waves, and its armies defend the mother city against foes long forgotten by history. This is not just the story of a city, it's the story of a civilization where commerce, culture, and cunning shaped an empire that rivaled the greatest powers of its time. So sit back, let the sails catch the wind, and prepare to see Carthage as you've never seen it before. Alive, ambitious, and unstoppable, long before the great walls of Carthage rose above the African shore, her spirit was already sailing the waves. Our story begins in the ancient city of Tyre, a jewel of the Phoenician coast, nestled in what is now Lebanon. Tyre was a city of traders, shipbuilders, and master navigators, a place where the scent of cedar mingled with the brine of the Mediterranean and the clamor of the marketplace. From Tyre's harbors, sleek galleys fanned out across the known world, their sails catching winds toward distant, glittering shores. These were not voyages of conquest, but of commerce and opportunity. The Phoenicians sought metals from Iberia, ivory from Africa, and precious dyes from their own secret stores. Their trade brought not only wealth but also knowledge, as they carried language, art, and ideas to every port. In this world of bustling trade routes, the demand for secure harbors and way stations grew. Merchant captains, wary of pirates and storms, needed safe havens for their ships. And so began the establishment of Phoenician colonies, small settlements scattered across the Mediterranean like stepping stones, Gadir in Iberia, Lixus in Morocco, and eventually the fabled Carthage. The first settlers who left Tyre for North Africa did so with mixed hearts, drawn by promise, but tethered to the homeland. Some were exiles, others ambitious merchants, still others the younger sons of noble families seeking fortunes their birthright could not grant. They brought with them not only their families and possessions, but their gods, Baal-Hamon, the great lord of the sky, and Tanit, the guardian mother. As their ships approached the North African coast, the settlers saw a land unlike their own. The deep blue of the sea gave way to golden sands and green fertile plains. Here, Berber tribes tended cattle and tilled the soil, their villages scattered across the hills. To the Phoenicians, this was a place where wealth could grow, where the sea's bounty could meet the riches of the land. Anticipation. The first meeting between the newcomers and the locals was cautious. Gifts were exchanged, Phoenician glass beads for Berber grain and hides. Trade was the bridge, and soon a fragile alliance formed. The settlers built simple wooden structures at first, then stone warehouses and a fortified dock. This was no empire yet, but the foundations of one were quietly being laid. In time, the story of this settlement would intertwine with legend, shaped by the arrival of a noblewoman from Tyre, Elissa, whom the Romans would later call Dido. But that is for another chapter. For now, the sails of Tyre's daughters are set, their course aimed at destiny. Carthage's seed has been planted, and history has taken root. The Phoenician foothold on the North African coast might have remained just another trading outpost, had fate not sent them a queen in exile. Her name was Elissa, Princess of Tyre, daughter of King Belus. She would later be immortalized by Roman poets as Dido, the tragic founder of Carthage. Her story begins in Tyre's royal palace, where courtly intrigue festered. After the death of her father, Elissa's brother Pygmalion seized the throne. Greedy for power and gold, Pygmalion murdered Elissa's husband, Acerbas, a high priest whose wealth was legendary. Fearing for her life, Elissa gathered loyal followers and fled under cover of night. They carried with them treasure, sacred relics, and the memory of a homeland now lost. Her voyage westward was perilous. At every port whispers followed. A queen without a throne, seeking a place to rule. The fleet stopped briefly in Cyprus, where Elissa took aboard a group of priestesses of Astarte, ensuring her new city would have the blessings of the gods. Eventually, the ships reached the shores where Phoenician merchants had already established a small settlement on the Gulf of Tunis. Legend tells that Elissa approached the local Berber ruler, King Arbas. Seeking land, he agreed to give her only as much land as could be enclosed by an ox hide. Elissa, clever and unyielding, had the hide cut into thin strips, binding them together to encircle a much larger area than anyone imagined. This plot, overlooking the sea, became the heart of her new city, Carthage, new city in the Punic tongue. Under Elissa's leadership, the settlement transformed almost overnight. Walls of stone replaced timber palisades. A harbor was expanded to shelter merchant fleets. Streets were laid out with precision, temples rose to Baal Hammon and Tanit, and markets filled with goods from across the known world. But the foundation of Carthage was more than stone and mortar. It was unity. Elissa fused the skills of Phoenician settlers with the knowledge of Berber allies, creating a hybrid culture that drew strength from both. Carthage was born not as a mere colony, but as a beacon for traders, artisans, and mercenaries from distant shores. Yet, the queen's reign was not without shadows. Some say King Arbas, spurned in marriage, threatened war, and Elissa, bound by honor and her vow to her dead husband, chose to end her life rather than betray her principles. Others claim she lived on, guiding her city until her death in peace. Whether history or legend, the story of Queen Elissa became the soul of Carthage, a reminder that cunning, courage, and vision could turn exile into empire. In the early years of Carthage, prosperity came quickly, but so did the threat of envy. Merchant fleets returned laden with silver from Iberia, grain from Africa's fertile plains, and exotic goods from faraway islands. With every new ship that docked, Carthage's fame spread, and with fame came danger. Pirates, rival merchants, and ambitious kings all cast greedy eyes toward the new city. Queen Elissa, or those who ruled in her stead after her passing, understood that Carthage's wealth would be meaningless if the city could not defend itself. Thus began the construction of the first great defensive walls, a task that would define the city's skyline for centuries. The earliest walls were built of massive stone blocks, hauled from nearby quarries by teams of laborers and beasts of burden. Skilled Phoenician masons directed the work, their voices echoing over the din of chisels striking stone. The walls followed the curve of the city's hill, embracing the temples, markets, and homes within. Watchtowers rose at intervals, allowing guards to keep vigil over both the harbor and the surrounding countryside. But these walls were more than stone. They were a statement. To any who approached from land or sea, they proclaimed, "This city is strong. This city will endure." The Berber allies of Carthage were impressed by the scale of the fortifications, and many contributed warriors to patrol the gates. Carthaginian ships patrolled the waters beyond the harbor, ensuring that no enemy fleet could approach unnoticed. The city was becoming not just a trading hub, but a fortress of power. Carthaginian children would later grow up playing in the shadow of these walls, running along narrow alleys that led to hidden posterns and guardhouses. Markets bustled just inside the gates, where traders felt safe conducting business under the protection of stone and spear. Over time, the walls would be expanded and reinforced, eventually becoming part of the most famous fortifications in the ancient Mediterranean. But in these early years, their presence was a sign that Carthage had moved beyond mere survival. It was preparing to stand as a lasting power. These walls were the bones of the city, strong enough to bear the weight of the centuries that would follow, and the foundation for the Carthaginian pride that would one day challenge even mighty Rome crucified. If Carthage's walls were her shield, then her harbor was her beating heart. By the mid-Bath century BCE, trade had transformed the new city into a hub for goods from across the Mediterranean. But the open shoreline, though scenic, left the fleet vulnerable to storms, piracy, and surprise attack. Carthage needed a harbor unlike any other, a harbor worthy of her ambition. Thus began the construction of the Kothon, a marvel of ancient engineering. The plan was bold, to carve an artificial double harbor into the coastline, one for merchant ships and one for the navy, each protected from the sea by massive breakwaters. The inner circle of the naval harbor would feature an island at its center, crowned with the admiral's headquarters, P, from which all ships could be surveyed at a glance. The merchant harbor came first, with long stone quays and warehouses to store cargoes of grain, silver, tin, and exotic goods. Ramps allowed ships to be hauled onto dry docks for repairs. Phoenician engineers, with their unmatched knowledge of maritime construction, directed teams of workers, while divers set massive foundation stones underwater. When the naval harbor was begun, it was unlike anything the Mediterranean had ever seen. The circular design allowed ships to maneuver quickly, each with its own slipway and storage space for sails and rigging. The central island housed workshops for repairing hulls, forges for crafting weapons, and storerooms for provisions. In times of war, the entire fleet could be launched in perfect formation within minutes. The Kothon was more than a functional structure. It was a statement of dominance. Any visiting trader knew that Carthage's wealth was protected by a navy, as disciplined as it was deadly. The mere sight of the harbor's circular symmetry and bustling activity inspired both awe and caution. Religious rites marked the harbor's completion. Priests of Baal, Hammon, and Tanit offered sacrifices on the central island, dedicating the harbor to the gods who watched over sailors. The smell of incense mingled with the salty air as the first warship slid into its berth. From this moment onward, the sea was truly Carthage's domain. With the Kothon at her command, she could defend her coasts, protect her trade, and project her power across the waves. The harbor became the city's lifeline, the source of her wealth, and the key to her future empire. By the time the Kothon's stone quays were finished, Carthage had become a magnet for merchants from every corner of the Mediterranean. Her harbors smelled of pitch, cedar, and spices. Her markets rang with the clatter of scales and the hum of bargaining voices in a dozen tongues. Carthaginian traders were heirs to the Phoenician tradition, masters of the sea whose ships could outpace storms, and whose captains could navigate by the stars alone. They sailed in sturdy, wide-bellied merchant galleys, their hulls painted in protective colors. Their sails dyed the famous Tyrian purple to display wealth and prestige. From the distant tin mines of Iberia came ingots, traded for North African grain, grown in the fertile plains beyond the city walls. From Sardinia and Corsica arrived copper, while silver from Andalusia poured into Carthage's treasuries. Egyptian papyrus, Greek olive oil, Cypriot copper, and even amber from the distant Baltic found their way to the new city's warehouses. The merchants were more than simple traders. They were diplomats and spies, gathering intelligence on rival cities while negotiating trade rights. Carthage's influence spread not only through her military might, but through commercial treaties that ensured her ships had safe harbor in friendly ports. These agreements often included clauses that forbade foreign merchants from sailing beyond certain points, preserving Carthage's monopoly on the most lucrative routes. The city's wealth was visible in its architecture. Temples with gilded doors, streets paved with cut stone, and houses decorated with fine mosaics. In the great market square, stalls overflowed with figs, dates, fine linen, perfumes, and rare purple dye in small, precious jars. Carthaginian coinage, stamped with the symbols of Baal Hammon and Tanit, circulated far beyond Africa's shores. Trade was also a family affair. Merchant dynasties rose in prominence, their names becoming synonymous with influence in the city's council. Sons apprenticed on voyages across the sea, learning not just navigation, but the delicate art of negotiation. Daughters often managed the family's commercial accounts, their skill with numbers and contracts, respected by all. But with wealth came rivalry. Greek merchants from Syracuse and Corinth sought to challenge Carthage's dominance, and rumors reached the city of Etruscan alliances, forming to control trade in the Tyrrhenian Sea. Carthage would need to defend not only her walls, but her sea lanes. Still, in this golden age, the heart of Carthage beat to the rhythm of commerce. Her merchants were her lifeblood, her ships the veins that carried prosperity, and her harbors the beating heart that made her the mistress of Mediterranean trade. Carthage's prosperity rested not only on her ships and soldiers, but on the blessings of her gods. For the people of Carthage, every voyage, every harvest, and every battle began and ended with offerings to the divine. At the heart of this faith stood two powerful deities, Baal Hammon, lord of the sky and fertility, and Tanit, the great goddess, protector of the city and mother of its people. Baal Hammon was often depicted as a bearded elder, crowned with horns of a ram, symbolizing strength and abundance. To him, the people prayed for fertile fields, healthy livestock, and the prosperity of trade. Tanit, in contrast, was represented as a graceful figure or a simple symbol, a triangle topped with a circle, flanked by outstretched arms. She was the patron of women, childbirth, and the city itself. The great temple district of Carthage rose on a high hill overlooking the harbor. Here, priests in white linen robes tended sacred fires that were never allowed to go out. Henschel 4. Incense smoke curled into the air, carrying prayers to the heavens. Merchants returning from distant lands brought exotic offerings, frankincense from Arabia, gold from Nubia, and rare animals for ritual displays. Religious festivals filled the city with color and music. And during the spring festival of Tanit, streets were decorated with garlands of flowers. Processions wound through the city, women in bright dresses carrying baskets of fruit, musicians playing lyres and flutes, and priests chanting ancient hymns. At the temple steps, sacrifices were made, grain, wine, incense, and on solemn occasions, animals chosen for their purity. Some practices of Carthaginian religion remained shrouded in controversy. Ancient sources, especially Roman writers, accused the city of offering human sacrifices to Baal Hammon in times of great peril. Whether exaggerated propaganda or a reflection of rare, desperate acts, such stories added to Carthage's fearful reputation among her enemies. Or, what is certain is that religion was deeply intertwined with every aspect of Carthaginian life. Naval expeditions began only after favorable omens were read. Markets opened with morning blessings from the temple priests. Even political decisions were made in consultation with the gods. Na, as the Council of Elders sought divine favor for their policies. To the Carthaginian mind, Baal Hammon and Tanit were not distant figures, but living presences, guardians of the city's destiny. In their names, Carthage would rise to challenge the greatest powers of the ancient world, counts. By the dawn of the 5th century BCE, Carthage's docks were overflowing with ships, her markets heavy with goods, and her temples rich with offerings. But as the city's wealth grew, so too did the influence of those who controlled it, the great merchant families. These dynasties, descended from the earliest settlers and enriched by generations of trade, began to shape not only commerce, but the very governance of the new city. In Carthage, political power was tied not to birth alone, but to wealth. And in this, the merchant princes thrived. Their fleets ranged across the Mediterranean, securing trade agreements, extracting tribute from smaller ports, and funding expeditions to untapped lands. Silver from Iberia, gold from Africa, and fine purple cloth from Tyre flowed through their warehouses, each shipment adding to their prestige. The city's Council of Elders, an assembly of the most powerful men in Carthage, was increasingly dominated by these merchants. They used their influence to pass laws favorable to trade, secure monopolies on certain goods, and fund the construction of public works that bore their names. Temples, granaries, aqueducts, and markets often doubled as monuments to the generosity and political ambition of their sponsors. Yet the rise of the merchant aristocracy also created tension. Smaller traders and craftsmen sometimes resented the dominance of a few wealthy houses. Berber allies, while benefiting from trade, were wary of becoming dependent on Carthaginian markets. Even within the council, rival merchant families maneuvered against one another, using alliances, marriages, and occasionally intrigue to secure dominance. The merchant elite maintained their power through a combination of generosity and fear. Public feasts, funded by their fortunes, kept the lower classes loyal. Donations to temples ensured the favor of priests, whose blessings could sway public opinion. Private militias, funded from their own coffers, defended their warehouses and ships. In times of crisis, it was often the merchant families who financed the city's defense, hiring mercenaries or outfitting warships from their own fleets. This further cemented their role as indispensable pillars of Carthaginian society. The rise of this class also influenced culture. Wealthy patrons sponsored artists, poets, and architects, commissioning mosaics and statues that blended Phoenician, Berber, and Hellenic styles. Banquets in their estates showcased imported delicacies, fine wines, and entertainment from across the known world. By now, Carthage was no longer a mere colony. It was an emerging power whose wealth and leadership could rival older civilizations. And at the helm were not kings or conquerors, but merchants whose vision extended far beyond the horizon. Their ambition would propel Carthage to greatness, but it would also sow the seeds of the rivalries that would one day threaten her stability. Lent. The rise of Carthage was not shaped by the sea alone. Beyond her walls stretched the vast North African hinterland, rolling plains, rugged mountains, and arid deserts, home to the Berber tribes who had inhabited the region for countless generations. To these tribes, The arrival of the Phoenicians was at first a curiosity, then an opportunity, and eventually a challenge to their independence. Early relations between Carthage and the Berbers were forged in trade. The tribes supplied grain, cattle, hides, and precious stones in exchange for Carthaginian goods, glass beads, fine textiles, metal tools, and luxury items from distant lands. Berber chieftains often rode into Carthage's markets with small retinues, their horses adorned with brightly dyed cloth and bronze fittings, bringing gifts for the city's rulers. Over time, some Berber tribes became close allies. They provided cavalry for Carthage's armies, guided merchant caravans through dangerous desert routes, and offered safe passage. Carthage, in turn, granted them access to exotic goods and shared military spoils. Intermarriage between Carthaginian elites and Berber nobility further strengthened these bonds, creating a web of personal and political ties. Yet not all tribes welcomed Carthaginian power. Some resented the growing influence of the coastal city over their affairs. Raids on Carthaginian caravans were not uncommon, and in lean years, tensions flared into open conflict. Carthage responded with both diplomacy and force, sending emissaries with gifts to placate some tribes, while dispatching armed expeditions to subdue others. One of the most important aspects of this relationship was the Berber cavalry. Lightly armed but swift and highly skilled, these horsemen could outmaneuver heavier infantry and were invaluable in both raiding and scouting. Carthage learned early that controlling the countryside required more than walls and fleets. It required the cooperation of those who knew the land best. Politically, Carthage leveraged its alliances to create a buffer zone between itself and other coastal powers. The Berber allies not only shielded Carthage from inland threats, but also served as intermediaries, with tribes deeper in the Sahara, opening routes to sub-Saharan gold and ivory. However, this delicate balance was always at risk. If Carthage pressed too hard for resources or attempted to dictate tribal politics, alliances could unravel quickly. Wise leaders in the Council of Elders knew that the Berbers were not subjects. They were partners whose loyalty had to be earned and renewed with each generation. The relationship between Carthage and the Berber tribes would remain a defining feature of the city's history. In peace, they were indispensable allies. In conflict, formidable foes. This dance of diplomacy and rivalry would shape the fortunes of the new city for centuries to come. Pregnant by the late 5th century BCE, Carthage was no longer satisfied with merely controlling its immediate shores. The wealth flowing through the Cothon, the protection of her walls, and the loyalty of Berber allies gave the city confidence to look outward toward the islands and coasts of the western Mediterranean. Expansion was not driven by conquest for its own sake, but by the logic of trade and security. To control the sea lanes was to control wealth itself. The first targets were natural extensions of Carthaginian commerce. Small Phoenician-founded outposts that had become isolated or weakened over time. Carthage offered them protection in exchange for loyalty, turning scattered settlements into a network of allied ports. From these stepping stones, her influence spread towards Sardinia, Corsica, and the Balearic Islands. The Balearics, famed for their deadly slingers, became a crucial source of mercenaries. Sardinia offered rich deposits of metals, while Corsica's forests provided shipped timber and resins. Carthaginian merchants moved swiftly to monopolize these resources, signing treaties with local chiefs or, when resisted, dispatching naval expeditions to enforce the city's will. The expansion was not without resistance. Greek colonies in southern France and Sicily viewed Carthage's growing power with alarm. Skirmishes at sea became more frequent as Carthaginian and Greek ships clashed over contested trade routes. These encounters, though small compared to later wars, taught Carthage valuable lessons in naval strategy and the importance of maintaining swift communication between outposts. To secure her gains, Carthage established fortified harbors at strategic points. Garrison forces, often a mix of Carthaginian citizens, Berber cavalry, and hired mercenaries, were stationed to protect these holdings. Supply convoys sailed on a regular schedule, ensuring that isolated garrisons never ran short of provisions or reinforcements. Diplomacy was just as important as military might. Carthaginian envoys visited local rulers bearing gifts of wine, oil, and fine cloth, securing alliances that would last for decades. In some cases, Carthage even mediated disputes between rival island tribes, positioning herself as a protector and benefactor. The expansion into the western Mediterranean marked a turning point. Carthage was no longer simply a prosperous city-state. It was becoming a maritime empire, a network of ports, colonies, and alliances that spanned from the African coast to the distant Atlantic approaches. This web of influence gave Carthage unmatched control over the flow of goods, from the tin of Iberia to the grain of Africa, and set her on a collision course with other powers who sought the same prize. The Mediterranean was vast, but in Carthage's eyes, it was a single unified sea, hers to master. Sardinia and Corsica were jewels in Carthage's maritime crown, two rugged islands lying like sentinels in the heart of the western Mediterranean. Controlling them meant securing vital sea lanes between Africa, Iberia, and Italy. For Carthage, they were both a shield and a treasure chest. Sardinia's wealth lay in its rich deposits of copper, lead, and silver, as well as fertile plains that could produce grain, olives, and wine. The Carthaginians established fortified settlements along its coasts, often taking over older Phoenician trading posts. From these bases, they projected power inland, negotiating with or subduing the Nuragic tribes who inhabited the mountainous interior. These tribes were fierce defenders of their land, their stone towers, known as nuraghe, standing as ancient symbols of independence. To win their cooperation, Carthage offered trade goods, tools, and occasional military aid against rival clans. So, Corsica, though less fertile, was prized for its dense forests of oak and pine, ideal for shipbuilding. Its coasts were dotted with natural harbors, perfect for resupply stations and safe havens during storms. Carthaginian woodcutters and shipwrights worked alongside local tribesmen in Ivuen, turning Corsican timber into the masts and hulls of the city's expanding fleet. The outposts on both islands were more than military garrisons. They were vibrant commercial hubs. Markets bustled with activity as Carthaginian merchants traded imported goods, fine textiles, pottery, and wine, for local resources. Each harbor had its own Cothan-style dock, scaled down from the great harbor of Carthage, allowing quick repairs and refits for the ships that patrolled the surrounding waters. No, but the islands were also contested ground, and Greek merchants from Massalia, modern Marseille, and Etruscan traders from the Italian coast vied for influence. Small-scale naval skirmishes were common, with each side testing the other's resolve. Carthage responded by reinforcing its garrisons and forging tighter alliances with friendly local leaders. Life on these outposts was demanding. Soldiers had to remain vigilant for raids from hostile tribes or rival powers. The climate could be harsh. Scorching summers and stormy winters tested the endurance of settlers and garrisons alike. Yet the rewards were great. Sardinian metals and Corsican timber flowed steadily into Carthage's docks, feeding the city's industries and strengthening her fleet. Passion. By the close of the 6th century BCE, Sardinia and Corsica had become indispensable links in Carthage's growing chain of influence. They were both guardians of the trade routes and sources of the raw materials that kept the city's heart beating. Without them, Carthage's expansion would have stalled. With them, she could reach ever farther across the sea. Sicily was the glittering prize of the central Mediterranean, a fertile island blessed with rich farmland, abundant fisheries, and a network of harbors perfectly placed along the trade routes between east and west. For Carthage, already dominant in North Africa and the western seas, controlling Sicily promised both wealth and strategic advantage. But Sicily was no empty prize. It was a contested land, home to powerful Greek colonies, indigenous Sicily tribes, and other Phoenician settlements that had been there for centuries. The Phoenicians had established outposts along the western coast of Sicily long before Carthage rose to prominence. Cities like Motia, Panormus, modern Palermo, and Soluntum served as way stations for trade with the central Mediterranean. When Carthage began asserting itself as a regional power, these settlements naturally looked to the new city for protection and leadership. At first, Carthaginian influence in Sicily grew through diplomacy and economic support. Merchant fleets supplied the Phoenician cities with goods from Africa and Iberia, while military advisors trained their militias. In return, these cities offered Carthage safe harbor, naval crews, and a share of their trade profits. But the Greeks, especially from Syracuse, Selinus, and Himera, were also expanding. Their colonies pushed westward, bringing them into direct contact with Phoenician lands. Trade competition soon turned to territorial disputes. Small clashes at sea and on land tested the resolve of both sides. Carthage quickly realized that maintaining its foothold in Sicily would require more than trade. It would demand a military presence. The Council of Elders authorized the dispatch of troops and the construction of fortified harbors in the western part of the island. Berber cavalry and Carthaginian infantry patrolled the countryside, protecting farmland from Greek raids. In the cities, new walls rose, gates were reinforced, and watchtowers kept constant vigil. Carthaginian Sicily also became a meeting point of cultures. Markets in Motia and Panormus offered goods from as far as Gaul and Egypt. Greek pottery and sculpture appeared alongside Punic jewelry and textiles. Some Greek merchants even did business under Carthaginian protection. Despite the political tensions, these first steps into Sicily marked the beginning of a long and often bloody struggle for control of the island, a conflict that would span centuries and involve some of the most famous battles of the ancient world. For now, Carthage's position was secure in the west, but the storm clouds of future wars were already gathering over the fertile fields and harbors of this contested island. Trident. By the mid-6th century BCE, Sicily had become a simmering cauldron of ambition. Carthage, with her fortified western cities, and the Greeks, entrenched in the east and south, eyed each other across fertile plains and busy sea lanes. For decades, they had coexisted in an uneasy balance, trading when it suited them, skirmishing when it did not. But as both powers expanded, that balance began to tip toward open war. The spark came not from Carthage itself, but from the local politics of the island. Greek cities like Selinus and Himera often quarreled, forming alliances that pulled in greater powers. When one faction sought Carthage's aid against a Greek rival, the Council of Elders saw both opportunity and risk. Carthage could strengthen its hold in western Sicily, but it could also provoke Syracuse, the most powerful Greek city on the island. The first significant clashes were at sea. Carthaginian warships, sleek and fast, intercepted Greek merchant vessels accused of violating trade agreements. Retaliation came swiftly, with Greek triremes raiding Punic coastal settlements. Soon, the conflict spilled onto land. Carthage dispatched a mixed force: Punic infantry, Berber cavalry, and contingents from allied Phoenician cities. Their aim was not yet full conquest, but the defense of existing territory and the intimidation of Greek rivals. The Greeks, for their part, relied on heavily armored hoplites, disciplined infantry whose tight formations could overwhelm lighter Carthaginian troops in open battle. One early engagement, fought near the river Cremisius, ended inconclusively. The Carthaginians used their cavalry to harass the Greek flanks, while Greek hoplites pressed forward in steady ranks. Neither side could deliver a decisive blow, but both returned home claiming victory. Diplomacy flickered between these bouts of violence. Envoys from both sides met to discuss boundaries, trade rights, and the return of prisoners. Yet each treaty seemed only to buy time for the next campaign. Carthage strengthened her fortifications in Motia and Panormus, while Syracuse and its allies expanded their fleets. The war was not yet total. This was still the prelude, the testing of strengths, the shaping of alliances. But it revealed much about the nature of the coming struggle. Carthage's strength lay in her navy, her wealth, and her ability to draw on diverse troops from across her empire. The Greeks relied on disciplined citizen soldiers and a fierce sense of independence. The fertile fields of Sicily were worth the fight. Whoever controlled them would hold not just a rich prize, but a strategic base for dominating the central Mediterranean. And so, in these first sparks of conflict, the long and bitter Carthaginian-Greek rivalry was born, one that would shape the fate of Sicily for centuries. Presenton. The origins of the sacred band are rooted in Carthage's early conflicts in Sicily. Greek hoplites, with their heavy armor and rigid discipline, had proven formidable opponents. The Council of Elders recognized the need for a comparable force, one that could match the Greeks' skill and cohesion on the battlefield. Thus, the sacred band was formed, an elite infantry corps modeled on the hoplite tradition, but infused with Carthaginian pride. While Carthage's fleets and armies secured her interests abroad, another, quieter force was shaping her destiny: diplomacy, treaties. In the ancient Mediterranean, treaties were signed not only with ink and seals, but with marriage alliances that bound families, cities, and even nations together through blood ties. For Carthage, diplomacy was as important as any military campaign. The Council of Elders maintained a network of skilled envoys who traveled across the sea, carrying gifts, negotiating treaties, and arranging unions between Carthaginian elites and influential foreign families. These marriages created bonds that could turn rivals into allies, and open new trade routes without a single sword being drawn. Within the city itself, the merchant aristocracy understood the power of marriage to strengthen both political and commercial influence. A union between two great houses could merge fleets, share trade monopolies, and secure control over seats in the council. When such alliances extended beyond Carthage's walls to Berber chieftains, Iberian princes, or even Greek merchant dynasties, the benefits multiplied. One notable example was the marriage of a Carthaginian noblewoman to the son of a Berber king, cementing an alliance that provided Carthage with cavalry support in future wars. In another case, a prominent Carthaginian merchant, married into a wealthy Greek trading family from Massalia, gaining access to Western Mediterranean ports otherwise closed to Punic ships. Diplomatic gifts often accompanied these unions. Gold jewelry, fine fabrics, exotic animals, or even entire ships. These were not mere luxuries, but symbols of goodwill and shared prosperity. Marriages also served as tools for peace after conflict. Following a bitter skirmish with an Iberian coastal tribe, Carthage ended hostilities by arranging the marriage of a Carthaginian governor's daughter to the tribal leader's eldest son. This not only restored trade, but transformed a potential enemy into a loyal trading partner. Yet diplomacy was a delicate art. A failed marriage alliance, whether through betrayal, jealousy, or shifting politics, could reignite hostilities. The council took care to match partners whose loyalties could be trusted, and often placed spies within these extended families to monitor any change in sentiment. In Carthage's worldview, war and diplomacy were not opposites, but two sides of the same coin. A naval blockade might weaken a city's resolve, but a well-timed marriage could secure it as an ally for generations. The ability to weave political, military, and family ties into a single strategy was one of Carthage's greatest strengths, and a reason her influence spread so widely without constant conquest. Through these bonds, Carthage expanded her reach across the Mediterranean. Her power rooted not only in her harbors and armies, but in the shared bloodlines that tied her fate to distant lands. Carthage's dominance of the Mediterranean was not built on grain and timber alone. It was forged in metals, colored by dyes, and adorned with the gleam of ivory. These commodities were the lifeblood of luxury and warfare alike, and Carthage controlled their flow with unmatched skill. From the silver mines of Iberia came great ingots, hauled in caravans to the ports, and loaded onto Punic merchant galleys. Silver served as both currency and tribute, filling Carthage's treasuries and funding her vast network of trade and defense. Copper and tin, vital for making bronze weapons and tools, arrived from Sardinia, Corsica, and distant lands along the Atlantic coast. Iron, harder and more enduring, flowed from Iberia and parts of North Africa, arming Carthage's soldiers and strengthening her fleet. Perhaps the most famous Carthaginian export was the Tyrian purple dye, extracted from the murex shellfish. This dye was so costly and rare that it became a symbol of royalty across the ancient world. Carthage's purple-dyed cloth traveled to the courts of kings in Egypt, Persia, and Greece, each bolt a testament to Punic craftsmanship and maritime reach. Ivory, sourced from sub-Saharan Africa through Berber intermediaries, was another prized commodity. Elephant tusks were carved into combs, figurines, inlays for furniture, and religious idols. Punic artisans transformed raw ivory into works of art, blending Phoenician design with African motifs, which were then sold to the wealthiest buyers from Rome to the Levant. The trade in these luxury goods was not without danger. Pirates prowled the sea lanes, and rival powers sought to intercept Carthaginian shipments. To protect their cargo, merchant ships often sailed in convoys, guarded by swift war galleys. Carthage's naval mastery meant that even valuable shipments could move safely across great distances. At the heart of this trade was the Cothon, Carthage's great harbor, where goods were offloaded, weighed, taxed, and stored in massive warehouses. From here, merchants organized redistribution across the empire, ensuring that every outpost, from Gadir in Iberia to Motia in Sicily, remained stocked with what the markets demanded. Control over metals, dyes, and ivory gave Carthage immense diplomatic leverage. A shipment of purple cloth could win a treaty. A gift of ivory could secure an alliance. Even the promise of steady metal supplies could bind another state's military fortunes to Carthage's will. These commodities were more than mere trade goods. They were symbols of prestige, power, and the far-reaching influence of a city that had turned commerce into empire. In every palace that displayed Punic ivory carvings, in every king's robe dyed purple by Carthaginian hands, the mark of Carthage was clear. The new city ruled not only by sword and ship, but by the treasures she brought from the ends of the earth. Clout. Egypt, the ancient kingdom of the Nile, was both a marvel and a magnet for Carthaginian ambition. Though separated by miles of a distance, Carthage and Egypt were linked by the great currents of the Mediterranean and the winding routes of desert caravans. Each possessed what the other desired. Carthage commanded metals, dyes, ivory, and timber. Egypt offered grain in abundance, gold from Nubia, papyrus, linen, and luxury goods from the east. The connection began at sea. Carthaginian merchant fleets sailed eastward along the North African coast, stopping at Cyrenaica before reaching the Nile Delta. Egyptian ports such as Naucratis welcomed Punic ships, though trade was often mediated by Greek or local Egyptian officials. In these bustling harbors, ivory from sub-Saharan Africa might be exchanged for papyrus scrolls, Nubian gold, and fine linen. But the sea was not the only path. Overland routes through the Libyan desert linked Carthage to Egyptian outposts. Berber guides, masters of desert travel, led camel caravans loaded with Punic goods across the arid expanse. These caravans brought not just commodities, but news, maps, and political messages between the two civilizations. The journey was dangerous. Sandstorms, hostile tribes, and the sheer vastness of the desert tested even the most experienced traders. Diplomatic relations between Carthage and Egypt were marked by mutual respect. Both were ancient cultures with deep religious traditions and long memories of empire. Carthage's envoys often brought lavish gifts to the pharaoh's court: Tyrian purple cloth, masterfully carved ivory, and exotic animals from the Maghreb. In return, Egyptian emissaries arrived in Carthage bearing gold ornaments, alabaster jars, and sacred amulets blessed by the temple priests of the Nile. Religious exchange also occurred. Carthaginian priests visited Egyptian temples, studying their rituals and architecture, while Egyptian artisans sometimes found work in Carthage, influencing Punic sculpture and painting. The cult of certain deities, particularly goddesses associated with fertility and protection, found echoes in both cultures, leading to a blending of religious symbols in art and jewelry. This trade network was not just about luxury goods. Egyptian grain, shipped in massive quantities, was a safeguard against famine for Carthage, while Punic metals and timber supplied Egypt's shipyards and armies. In times of regional conflict, these economic ties could mean the difference between scarcity and survival. By maintaining strong links with Egypt, Carthage secured an eastern partner whose resources complemented her own. This relationship also gave Carthage indirect access to the Red Sea trade, as Egyptian merchants could channel goods from Arabia, India, and even East Africa into Punic hands. Thus, the bond between Carthage and Egypt was more than commercial. It was a strategic partnership spanning desert and sea, ensuring that the two great powers of Africa remained connected in prosperity. Colophonic. For Carthage, the sea was both highway and battlefield. Her wealth and survival depended on the mastery of maritime trade routes, and that meant constant innovation in ship design, navigation, and naval tactics. By the 6th century BCE, Carthaginian shipwrights were producing some of the most advanced vessels in the Mediterranean, sleek, fast, and built for both commerce and war. Carthaginian engineers refined the bireme and trireme, the multi-oared warships originally pioneered by the Phoenicians and Greeks, into models optimized for speed, maneuverability, and endurance. They experimented with hull shapes that could slice through waves, reinforced rams for shattering enemy ships, and modular deck designs allowing for quick repairs. In merchant shipping, they developed wide-bellied cargo vessels capable of carrying massive loads without sacrificing seaworthiness. One of their key innovations was the integration of dry docks within fortified harbors, which enabling ships to be hauled out of the water for maintenance and refitting, a system that kept the Carthaginian navy in peak condition year-round. The Great Kothon itself was a testament to this foresight, with its circular naval harbor and central island, serving as a command hub and repair station. Navigex avsinx, Carthaginian sailors relied not only on the stars, but on an encyclopedic knowledge of currents, prevailing winds, and seasonal weather patterns. They charted routes that hugged the African and Iberian coasts for safety and plotted open sea passages to save time. Punic maps, closely guarded state secrets, detailed every safe anchorage, hidden reef, and reliable freshwater source known to their captains. Carthage also pioneered convoy tactics, grouping merchant ships under the protection of armed escorts. Warships were trained to perform feigned retreats, sudden flank attacks, and coordinated ramming maneuvers. Boarding parties of marines, often composed of fierce mercenaries, could quickly turn a naval engagement into a decisive capture. These advancements were not purely. Carthage's growing empire required power projection, swift responses to piracy, rapid deployment of troops, and the ability to blockade enemy ports. The navy was as much an instrument of diplomacy as of war. A display of Carthaginian triremes in a foreign harbor could compel tribute or secure a favorable treaty without a single battle. The constant refinement of ships and tactics ensured that Carthage remained a maritime superpower. Rivals could match her on land, but few dared challenge her at sea. Her innovations would later be studied and adapted by both Greek and Roman navies, a lasting testament to the ingenuity of her shipwrights and the strategic vision of her admirals. In the end, the mastery of the sea was not just a military advantage. It was the lifeblood of Carthage, the thread binding her far-flung territories into a single, thriving empire. Colthi. Among the many warriors who served in Carthage's armies, few inspired as much respect and fear as the Balearic slingers. Hailing from the Balearic Islands, these mercenaries were famed across the Mediterranean for their uncanny accuracy and devastating power with the sling, a weapon as old as warfare itself. For the people of the Balearics, slinging was not merely a skill learned in adulthood. It was a way of life, taught from childhood. Legend says that island mothers would not give their sons bread until they could knock it from a post with a sling. By the time they reached manhood, these warriors could hurl stones with such speed that they could dent bronze shields and even kill at great distances. Carthage first encountered the Balearic slingers during her westward expansion. Recognizing their value, Carthaginian commanders began recruiting them as auxiliary troops. Contracts were negotiated with island chieftains, who sent contingents of their best men in exchange for payment in gold, fine goods, and certain trade privileges. In battle, the Balearic slingers served as skirmishers, positioned ahead of the main force or on the flanks. Their role was to harass the enemy with a relentless hail of stones, but forcing opposing troops to raise their shields and disrupting tight formations. Against Greek hoplites, this tactic was especially effective. Slings could outrange bows, and the lead projectiles used by these mercenaries could pierce light armor. The slingers carried multiple slings of different lengths, short for close combat, medium for standard range, and long for extreme distance. Their ammunition ranged from smooth beach stones to carefully molded lead bullets, each marked with symbols or insults meant to demoralize the enemy. Carthaginian generals valued these warriors not only for their skill, but for their discipline. In the chaos of battle, the slingers could quickly retreat behind friendly lines, reload, and reposition for another barrage. They were often paired with light infantry or cavalry to exploit the disorder they created in enemy ranks. Life as a mercenary in Carthage's service offered the Balearic warriors wealth and prestige, but it also meant adapting to the broader Punic military system. They fought in Sicily, Iberia, North Africa, and even in defensive battles around Carthage itself. Wherever they went, their reputation preceded them. The presence of Balearic slingers on the battlefield was a sign that Carthage was serious. Their whistling projectiles were often the first sound an enemy heard in a Punic assault, and, for many, the last. Through their alliance with these island warriors, Carthage added yet another deadly edge to her already formidable military machine. In Carthage, religion was not confined to temples and priests. It was woven into the rhythm of everyday life. From the humblest dock worker to the most powerful merchant prince, all lived under the gaze of the gods, and every action, public or private, was touched by ritual. The two chief deities, Baal Hammon and Tanit, were honored daily in prayers, offerings, and symbolic gestures. Before merchants set sail, they poured libations of wine into the harbor waters for safe passage. Annan Boshanj, farmers blessed their fields with incense smoke before planting, invoking fertility and abundance. Even in the bustling markets, small shrines stood in corners, where traders paused to whisper thanks for a good sale. Carthage's calendar was dotted with festivals that brought the entire city to life. In the spring, the festival of Tanit celebrated renewal and fertility. Streets were decorated with garlands, and processions of women in white robes carried baskets of flowers to her temple. Musicians played lyres, drums, and flutes, while dancers moved in intricate patterns, reenacting myths of creation and protection. Baal Hammon's feast, held after the harvest, was a more solemn affair. Families brought the first fruits of their fields to the temple, along with animals for sacrifice. Priests in white linen robes and ram-horned headdresses chanted prayers as incense filled the air. These offerings were believed to ensure the next year's prosperity and to honor the god's role as guardian of the community. PC. Other deities, too, were part of Carthage's spiritual life. Phoenician gods shared altars with local Berber spirits, and influences from Egypt and Greece blended into the city's pantheon. Sailors prayed to Melkat for strength, artisans to Kothar wa Cassis for skill, and mothers to Astarte for the health of their children. Rituals were often public spectacles. Priests would interpret omens by studying the flight of birds or the patterns left in sacrificial ashes. Marriage ceremonies included blessings from both family shrines and temple priests, ensuring the gods witnessed and approved the union. Even political decisions, such as declaring war, were preceded by religious consultation, for to act without divine sanction was unthinkable. Religion also marked the transitions of life. Births were celebrated with naming ceremonies in the Temple of Tanit. Coming of age rites for young men included public oaths to serve the city and its gods. Funerals blended mourning with ritual, sending the deceased into the afterlife with offerings, amulets, and prayers. Through these festivals and daily practices, religion bound the people of Carthage together. It was the shared language of devotion that connected sailor to soldier, farmer to noble, and citizen to city. In the eyes of the Carthaginians, as long as they honored their gods faithfully, the favor of Baal-Hamon and Tanit would keep their city strong and their ships safe on the wide and unpredictable sea, Crunthit. On the southern edge of Carthage, near the shore but apart from the bustling markets and crowded streets, lay a sacred and somber place, the Tophet, enclosed by stone walls, shaded by olive trees, and filled with rows of carved stelae. It was a sanctuary dedicated to Baal-Hamon and Tanit. To the Carthaginians, it was a place of devotion and offering. To their enemies, it became a symbol of fear and accusation. The Tophet was both temple and open-air shrine. Within its grounds, altars stood for sacrifices, and beyond them lay carefully tended plots where urns were buried. These urns, filled with ashes and bones, were placed beneath carved stone markers depicting stylized symbols. The raised arms of Tanit, the crescent moon, or sacred animals. Many stelae bore inscriptions, giving thanks to the gods for granting a prayer or vow. For the people of Carthage, offerings at the Tophet were acts of profound piety, the dedication of something precious, whether a lamb, a bird, or in rare and extreme cases, a human life, was a way of binding the city's fate to the favor of the gods. Roman and Greek sources, hostile to Carthage, accused the city of practicing regular child sacrifice, portraying it as a barbaric and cruel ritual. Some modern historians argue these accounts were exaggerated propaganda, meant to vilify a powerful rival. Others point to archaeological evidence suggesting that, at times of great crisis, the Carthaginians may indeed have offered their most precious gifts, their own children, to secure divine aid. Whatever the truth, the Tophet was a place of reverence for the Carthaginians themselves. Families came here to fulfill vows, to give thanks for recovery from illness, victory in battle, or safe return from a dangerous voyage. Priests conducted ceremonies that involved chanting, burning incense, and placing offerings into the sacred fire. The air would be thick with smoke and the scent of frankincense, and the flicker of flames would dance against the stone stelae. Ticked. The site was also a place of remembrance. The stelae served as markers of devotion, recording the names of those who had made offerings. Visitors could walk among them, reading inscriptions that told of blessings received and prayers answered. In this way, the Tophet was both a sacred space and a record of Carthage's spiritual history. To outsiders, the Tophet became a focus of suspicion and horror. To Carthage's own people, it was an essential link between mortal and divine, a place where the fate of the city could be bargained for in the language of sacrifice and prayer. Far to the west of Carthage lay one of the richest lands in the ancient world, Iberia. Its mountains and river valleys hid vast deposits of silver, copper, tin, and gold. For Carthage, control of these resources meant not only wealth, but the ability to finance fleets, pay armies, and maintain dominance in the Mediterranean. The Phoenicians had traded along the Iberian coast for centuries. But by the 6th century BCE, Carthage was taking a more active role. Carthaginian ships sailed regularly to Qadira, modern Cadiz, a thriving port that became a key base for Punic activity in the region. From here, merchants and soldiers pushed inland, forging alliances with local tribes and establishing fortified trading posts. The silver mines, particularly in the south near the Guadalquivir River, were the crown jewel of Iberian trade. Carthaginian engineers introduced advanced mining techniques, using wooden supports to shore up tunnels, drainage systems to keep shafts dry, and smelting furnaces capable of producing high-purity ingots. These ingots were stamped with Punic markings before being shipped to Carthage, where they would become coinage, pay mercenaries, or be traded for luxury goods from the east. But controlling Iberia was not simply a matter of digging metal from the ground. The land was divided among numerous tribes, some eager for Carthaginian trade and protection, others fiercely independent. Punic diplomacy here was as important as military strength. Envoys offered weapons, wine, and fine cloth to local chiefs in exchange for mining rights. In many cases, Carthage provided military assistance against rival tribes, cementing alliances through shared victories, yet there were always tensions. Some Iberian tribes resented Punic influence and attacked mining settlements or trade caravans. Carthage responded with fortified garrisons, often manned by mixed forces of Punic soldiers, Berber cavalry, and Iberian allies loyal to Carthage. Iberia's wealth also attracted rivals. Greek traders from Massalia sought to undermine Punic control by offering better deals to local chiefs, while pirates from the Balearic Islands targeted silver shipments. Carthaginian naval escorts became a regular feature along the Iberian coast, ensuring the safe passage of precious cargo. The silver from Iberia funded Carthage's growing empire. It paid for the construction of new warships, the hiring of elite mercenary units, and the expansion of public works at home. In many ways, Iberia was Carthage's economic engine. Without it, the city's ambitions would have been far harder to sustain. In time, Carthage's stake in Iberia would deepen even further, eventually making it a core part of her overseas possessions. For now, in the pre-Hannibal era, it was a land of opportunity, alliance, and occasional bloodshed, a place where the sparkle of silver lit the path to empire. Carthage's empire was not only a maritime network, it stretched inland, across the rugged plains and arid deserts of North Africa. While her fleets ruled the seas, her caravans carried goods deep into the continent, linking the city to gold fields, ivory markets, and exotic trade routes that reached far beyond the Sahara. But with wealth came danger. Raiders, rival tribes, and the harshness of the desert itself threatened these vital arteries of commerce. To safeguard them, Carthage built a chain of forts and garrisons along key caravan routes. These were not massive stone citadels like her coastal walls, but practical strongholds, square or rectangular enclosures with high mud brick or stone walls, corner watchtowers, and a central courtyard. Positioned near oases or strategic crossroads, they served as both way stations and defensive posts. Garrisons housed mixed forces, Punic infantry, Berber cavalry, and sometimes mercenaries familiar with desert warfare. Soldiers patrolled the surrounding terrain, escorting caravans through dangerous stretches and responding quickly to reports of raiders. Scouts, often Berbers who knew every dune and ravine, ranged far ahead to spot trouble before it reached the fort. Within the forts, life was harsh but ordered. Soldiers drilled in the morning to maintain readiness, maintained weapons and equipment in the heat of the day, and took turns on watch through the cool desert nights. Caravans arriving from the south brought life to these outposts. Traders unloading ivory tusks, ostrich feathers, incense, and gold dust in exchange for Punic cloth, tools, and wine. Diplomacy played a role in this defense network. Carthaginian commanders often negotiated agreements with local tribes, paying them in goods or coin to keep the peace or assist in guarding the routes. In some cases, tribal leaders were given honorary titles or married into Punic merchant families to strengthen bonds. The desert forts were also communication hubs. Messengers on horseback or camel carried news between them and the coast, ensuring that the council in Carthage remained informed of events in the hinterlands. Fires lit atop watchtowers at night could signal danger, their glow visible across miles of open land. Despite these precautions, desert warfare was unpredictable. Raiders could appear suddenly, striking before the alarm was raised. When attacked, garrisons relied on their fortified walls and disciplined archers to repel assaults until reinforcements arrived. Many of these skirmishes never made it into grand historical accounts, but they were the daily reality that kept Carthage's inland lifelines secure. In protecting her trade routes across the desert, Carthage demonstrated that her empire was not bound by the sea alone. The same discipline, organization, and strategic foresight that built her navy also sustained her inland empire, allowing the wealth of Africa to flow steadily into the harbors of the new city, Rouen. As Carthage's power expanded across the Mediterranean and into Africa, its political leadership began to consolidate under influential families. Among them, none were more prominent in the early centuries than the Magonids, a dynasty whose name would be remembered for generations. The origins of the Magonid rise can be traced to Mago I, a leader of exceptional skill and ambition. Serving as Safete, a chief magistrate akin to a consul, Mago combined military ability with commercial acumen. Under his guidance, Carthage strengthened her naval dominance, secured key territories in Sardinia and Sicily, and tightened her control over vital trade routes. Unlike monarchies of the East, Carthage's political system was oligarchic, with power shared among the Council of Elders and 2 annually elected suffetes. However, families like the Magonids wielded influence far beyond their official terms through wealth, alliances, and the loyalty of both the merchant aristocracy and the military. Mago I's reign set the tone for the dynasty. He sponsored the construction of public works, expanded the fleet, and led successful campaigns against rival powers in the Western Mediterranean. His sons and grandsons inherited not only his name but his vision, continuing to expand Carthaginian influence through a combination of diplomacy, trade, and warfare. The Magonids were known for their careful balance of internal and external policy. Domestically, they maintained the loyalty of the council by ensuring that elite families shared in the spoils of conquest and trade. Abroad, they cultivated alliances with Berber tribes, Iberian chiefs, and Phoenician colonies, weaving a network of support that extended Carthage's reach without the need for constant direct rule. Militarily, the Magonids proved adept at blending Carthage's strengths, naval supremacy, mercenary armies, and fortified outposts into a coherent strategy. They avoided unnecessary conflicts with distant powers, focusing instead on consolidating nearby territories and protecting Carthage's commercial lifelines. Their leadership was not without challenges. Greek cities in Sicily remained a persistent threat, and rival factions within Carthage sometimes accused the Magonids of seeking too much personal power. Yet the family's consistent record of success kept them in the city's highest offices for decades. Over time, Magonid became synonymous with stability, expansion, and the Punic ideal of leadership. Pragmatic, resourceful, and loyal to the prosperity of the city above all. In the centuries before Hannibal, it was this dynasty that set the standard for how Carthage's leaders would rule, not as kings, but as stewards of a maritime empire whose power rested on the twin pillars of commerce and defense, Trisons. By the early 5th century BCE, Carthage's foothold in western Sicily, secured through alliances with Phoenician cities like Motia and Panormus, was under growing pressure. The Greek colonies in the east, led by powerful Syracuse, sought to expand westward, threatening Punic territory and trade routes. For years, tensions simmered through small-scale raids and naval skirmishes, but the spark for a full-scale war came when the Greek city of Selinus clashed with its neighbor, Himera, and both sides sought foreign allies. Himera called upon Syracuse for aid, while Selinus turned to Carthage. The Council of Elders, under Maganid leadership, saw this as an opportunity to strengthen Punic influence and check Greek expansion. An expedition was organized, one of the largest Carthage had ever launched. The army included Punic citizens, Berber cavalry, Iberian mercenaries, Balearic slingers, and contingents from allied cities. The fleet, commanded by seasoned admirals, carried supplies, siege equipment, and troops across the narrow channel from Africa to Sicily. The campaign began well. Selinus welcomed Carthaginian reinforcements, and together they pushed back Greek incursions in the west. But the true test came at the Battle of Himera c. by Bashars BCE, where Carthage faced a united Greek force led by Gelon of Syracuse. According to later accounts, Carthage fielded tens of thousands of troops under the command of General Hamilcar, a Maganid. The Greeks, however, fought with the advantage of unity and the formidable discipline of their hoplite phalanx. In a brutal day-long battle, Carthaginian forces were overwhelmed. Hamilcar reportedly fought to the last, with thin strew, either falling in combat or, according to some sources, perishing in a ritual fire to honor Baal Hammon. The defeat at Himera was catastrophic. Thousands of Carthaginian soldiers were killed or captured, and the fleet retreated to Africa. The loss shook Carthage's confidence and curtailed her ambitions in Sicily for decades. In the aftermath, the city negotiated peace, ceding influence in parts of the island to the Greeks and agreeing to avoid further intervention. For a time, despite the disaster, the war taught Carthage valuable lessons. It underscored the importance of unified command, the need for better coordination between diverse troops, and the challenges of confronting the heavily armored Greek hoplites head-on. Over the next generation, Carthage would rebuild her forces, refine her strategies, and prepare for the day when she could challenge Greek power again. The First Sicilian War was a sobering chapter in Carthage's history, a reminder that even the greatest maritime empire of the West could be humbled. But it was also the beginning of a rivalry that would dominate Punic foreign policy for centuries. The crushing defeat at Himera was more than a military setback. It was a wake-up call for Carthage. The Greek cities of Sicily had shown they could match Punic naval power with disciplined armies and strong fortifications. If Carthage hoped to reclaim influence on the island and protect her far-flung empire, she would need to master the art of siege warfare. Before Himera, Carthaginian commanders had relied heavily on speed and naval superiority. Many coastal cities could be pressured into submission by blockades or quick assaults, but inland Greek settlements, fortified with massive stone walls and defended by hoplites, demanded a different approach. The Greeks' ability to hold out for months behind their defenses forced Carthage to adapt. In the years after the First Sicilian War, the Council of Elders invested in specialized siege equipment. Engineers, some recruited from Greece and the Levant, designed battering rams with iron-shod heads, towering siege ladders, and wheeled shelters to protect soldiers from arrows and stones. The Helpolis, a massive multi-storied siege tower, was introduced to bring Punic troops level with enemy walls. Supply lines also became a priority. A siege was as much a test of endurance as of force. Carthaginian fleets were tasked with maintaining constant deliveries of food, water, and reinforcements to armies in the field. Fortified camps were built near target cities, complete with defensive ditches and palisades, to protect the besiegers from counterattack. One notable test of these new tactics came in the siege of a rebellious Phoenician city in Sardinia. The defenders, confident in their high walls, mocked the Punic army from above. But Carthage deployed siege engines in a coordinated assault. Courtons. Rams broke open the gates, while towers allowed archers to rain arrows into the city's streets. Within days, the defenders surrendered, and the swift victory demonstrated that Carthage's investment in siegecraft was already paying dividends. Training was also reformed. Units were drilled in the construction and operation of siege machinery, with carpenters, blacksmiths, and engineers working alongside soldiers in the field. This integration of specialists into the army ensured that no campaign would be stalled for lack of technical skill. Siege warfare also had a psychological dimension. Carthaginian commanders learned to combine shows of force with offers of lenient terms to cities that surrendered early, preserving resources and avoiding unnecessary destruction. Cities that resisted too long, however, were made examples of, their fortifications dismantled to prevent future rebellion. Through these adaptations, Carthage transformed from a naval power that relied on swift strikes into a more balanced military force capable of prolonged campaigns. The lessons learned in these early sieges would serve her well in the coming centuries, as Sicily, and later even greater enemies, would again test her resolve. While Carthage was famed for her fleets and armies, the city itself was also a masterpiece of art and architecture. Rising above the turquoise waters of the Gulf of Tunis, her skyline blended the elegance of Phoenician heritage with the influences of Berber, Greek, and Egyptian styles, an expression of her role as a crossroads of civilizations. At the heart of the city stood towering temples, dedicated to Baal, Hammon, and Tanit, their facades lined with carved columns and adorned with brightly painted reliefs. The temples were built from pale limestone that glowed golden in the afternoon sun. Intricate friezes depicted ships, animals, and divine symbols, each telling a story of the gods' blessings upon the city. Residential districts showcased a different side of Punic architecture. Wealthy merchant families lived in multi-storied houses with central courtyards, shaded by fig trees and surrounded by colonnades. Floors were paved with mosaics, geometric patterns or scenes from mythology, crafted from tiny, colorful tiles. Even modest homes had plastered walls and small altars to household gods, blending beauty with practicality. Public spaces reflected Carthage's prosperity. The main market square was lined with colonnades and open-air stalls. Nearby, the council hall housed the city's political leaders, its chambers, decorated with carved wooden panels and bronze fittings. In the harbor district, massive warehouses stored goods from across the Mediterranean, their walls reinforced to protect against fire and sea spray. Carthaginian artisans excelled in metalwork, ceramics, and ivory carving. Bronze figurines of deities, elaborately decorated amphorae, and finely worked jewelry were in high demand throughout the Punic world. Many designs bore the distinctive symbols of Carthage: palm trees, crescent moons, and the open hands of Tanit, marking them as unmistakably Punic. Cultural exchange played a huge role in the city's artistic development. Greek craftsmen brought techniques in sculpture and pottery. Egyptian artisans contributed stone carving styles and motifs. Berber traditions influenced textile patterns and decorative woodwork. This blending produced a unique aesthetic that was recognizably Carthaginian yet cosmopolitan. Public art also carried political meaning. monuments commemorating naval victories, reliefs depicting processions of priests and warriors, and inscriptions honoring the city's benefactors reminded citizens and visitors alike of Carthage's power and piety. Even functional architecture was designed with beauty in mind. Aqueducts carried fresh water into the city, their arches a graceful part of the skyline. Streets were carefully laid out to connect key districts, and defensive walls, impressive in scale, were as finely constructed as any temple. To walk through Carthage in her prime was to experience the fusion of art and empire. Every building, from the grandest shrine to the humblest home, reflected the city's wealth, ambition, and deep-rooted traditions. In stone, bronze, and painted tile, Carthage proclaimed her identity, not just as a naval power, but as a cultural beacon in the ancient Mediterranean coast. While Carthage's harbors were the lifelines of her maritime empire, her true foundation of wealth lay inland, in the fertile fields of North Africa. The region's rich soil, mild climate, and skillful farming methods turned the land into one of the ancient world's most productive breadbaskets, capable of feeding not just the city itself, but also her fleets, armies, and distant colonies. The plains surrounding Carthage were a patchwork of grain fields, olive groves, and vineyards. Farmers cultivated wheat and barley in vast quantities, producing enough to export to allied and subject territories. Olives were pressed into oil, an essential commodity for cooking, lighting, and trade, while grapes yielded wines prized across the Mediterranean. Carthaginian agriculture was highly organized and innovative. Simply, but fronti, large estates, owned by wealthy merchant families, were worked by tenant farmers, slaves, and seasonal laborers. These estates often featured advanced irrigation systems, stone-lined canals, underground cisterns, and shadoof-style water-lifting devices adapted from Egyptian techniques. Carthage's agricultural treatises, such as those attributed to the later writer Mago, outlined crop rotations, soil management, and the cultivation of fruit trees, making Punic farming methods some of the most respected in the ancient world. Beyond the plains, Berber tribes contributed to the food supply by herding cattle, sheep, and goats. These pastoral communities exchanged meat, wool, and hides for grain and luxury goods. In the hill country, figs, pomegranates, and dates grew in abundance, further diversifying the agricultural bounty. The surplus from this system did more than feed the population. It fueled Carthage's expansion. Grain shipments, sustained overseas garrisons, and fleets on long campaigns. Olive oil and wine became valuable exports, traded for metals, timber, and luxury goods. During sieges or lean years, the city could draw on vast reserves stored in state granaries, ensuring resilience in the face of crisis. Agriculture also had a sacred dimension. Harvest festivals honored Baal Hammon, the god of fertility and renewal. Offerings of first fruits were brought to the temples, accompanied by music, dancing, and public feasts. Farmers believed that divine favor was essential to maintaining the land's bounty, and rituals often marked the beginning and end of each planting season. This agricultural strength gave Carthage a decisive advantage over many of her rivals. Cities that relied solely on trade could be strangled by blockades, but Carthage's fields ensured that her people and her armies could endure. In the centuries before Hannibal, this breadbasket of North Africa was the silent engine behind Carthage's rise, turning sunlight, soil, and labor into the power that carried her ships across the Mediterranean lines. In Carthage, wealth was power, and no group embodied this more than the merchant princes. The elite families who commanded vast fleets controlled international trade and shaped the politics of the city. Their fortunes were built on the steady flow of goods from every corner of the Mediterranean, and their influence reached into every council chamber, harbor, and marketplace. These men were not kings, yet their status rivaled royalty. A merchant prince might own dozens of ships, estates in Africa and Sicily, warehouses in Iberia and Sardinia, and shares in lucrative mining ventures. His home in Carthage would be a grand villa with mosaic floors, colonnaded courtyards, and storerooms filled with exotic imports, Egyptian linens, Greek pottery, Iberian silver, and African ivory. In politics, the merchant princes were the backbone of the Council of Elders, using their positions to pass laws that favored trade, expanded Punic influence abroad, and safeguarded commercial monopolies. Many served as suffetets, chief magistrates, alternating between civic leadership and private enterprise. It was not uncommon for a merchant prince to personally finance a naval expedition, reaping both profit and prestige. Iwenshi. Their wealth also allowed them to act as patrons of religion and the arts. Temples to Baal Hammon and Tanit often bore inscriptions naming the families who had funded their construction. Public festivals, athletic games, and charitable grain distributions were sponsored by these elites, reinforcing their image as protectors and benefactors of the city. Yet their dominance was not without rivals. Smaller merchants, artisans, and farmers sometimes accused the great families of hoarding wealth and manipulating policy to crush competition. Disputes within the council could become fierce, especially when two powerful families competed for the same trade concession or political office. Despite these tensions, the merchant princes understood that their personal fortunes were tied to the stability and prosperity of Carthage. In times of war, they provided loans to the state, outfitted warships from their own fleets, and even commanded military. Their deep knowledge of trade routes made them valuable strategists, capable of predicting enemy movements and supply needs. Internationally, merchant princes often acted as unofficial diplomats. Their contacts with foreign rulers, built through years of trade, allowed them to negotiate treaties and mediate disputes without the need for formal envoys. Some maintained agents in distant ports to report on political developments, giving Carthage an intelligence network woven into her commercial empire. The influence of the merchant princes was a defining feature of Carthaginian society. They were proof that in Carthage, power came not solely from the sword or the temple, but from the steady, disciplined mastery of commerce. A force as strong as any army, and one that would shape the destiny of the city for centuries. Tavet. In the centuries before Hannibal, Carthage's rise as a maritime power was mirrored in the central Mediterranean by another formidable seafaring people, the Etruscans. To visit node, based in what is now Tuscany, the Etruscans controlled a powerful confederation of city-states whose influence extended across the Tyrrhenian Sea. Like Carthage, they were masters of trade, skilled metalworkers, and shrewd diplomats. The two powers shared both interests and rivals. Greek colonies in southern Italy and Sicily posed a mutual thin threat, competing for trade routes and attempting to dominate key harbors. Recognizing the advantage of Carthage and the Etruscans formed a strategic alliance, one of the most important maritime partnerships of the ancient world. At the heart of this alliance was a series of treaties that divided spheres of influence. Carthage would dominate trade in the western and southern Mediterranean, while the Etruscans held sway in the northern Tyrrhenian Sea and along the Italian peninsula. Both agreed to limit Greek expansion and support each other in naval conflicts. The partnership was not just political, it was also deeply economic. Etruscan ships brought fine pottery, bronze goods, and iron weapons to Carthage, while Punic merchants supplied Etruria with African ivory, Iberian silver, and luxury items from the east. Joint ventures saw Etruscan shipwrights working in Punic harbors, and Carthaginian navigators sailing alongside their Italian counterparts on exploratory voyages. One of the most notable moments of cooperation came during the Battle of Alalia, circa Wubat Sanstawu BCE, when Carthaginian and Etruscan fleets combined to confront Greek colonists from Phocea, who had established a base on Corsica. The joint Punic-Etruscan force succeeded in limiting Greek expansion, though the battle was fierce and costly. This victory cemented their alliance and demonstrated the effectiveness of their combined naval power. Diplomatic exchanges between Carthage and the Etruscan League were formal and ceremonial. Envoys from both sides brought lavish gifts, gold jewelry, intricately worked helmets, fine textiles, and participated in religious rituals to honor each other's gods. Cultural exchange was evident in the blending of artistic motifs. Punic designs appeared in Etruscan jewelry, while Etruscan metalwork techniques influenced Carthaginian craftsmen. Though the alliance was strong, it was also pragmatic. Both sides understood that their cooperation rested on shared interests, and if those interests changed, so too could the relationship. For now, however, the partnership served its purpose. It allowed both Carthage and the Etruscans to flourish while keeping Greek ambitions in check. This maritime alliance reinforced Carthage's position as a central hub of Mediterranean trade, proving that in the ancient world, diplomacy and shared enemies could forge bonds as strong as any wall or fleet. Carthage's soul was Phoenician. Though she had grown into a power far removed from her ancestral cities of Tyre and Sidon, the new city preserved the language, script, and cultural identity of her founders. In her streets, markets, and council chambers, Punic, the Western form of the Phoenician tongue, was the language of trade, law, and daily life. The Punic alphabet, inherited from Phoenicia, was one of the most efficient writing systems of the ancient world. Consisting of a set of consonantal characters written from right to left, it was simple enough for merchants and scribes to master quickly, yet precise enough to record complex contracts, religious texts, and its influence was profound. Through Greek adaptation, the Phoenician alphabet became the ancestor of Latin and, eventually, most modern scripts. In Carthage, writing was everywhere. Stone stelae bore inscriptions honoring the gods, commemorating victories, or marking dedications in temples. In the harbor district, shipping manifests were scratched onto wax tablets or inscribed on papyrus scrolls. The Council of Elders kept meticulous records of laws and trade agreements, preserved in archives guarded by temple priests. The written word was not solely for bureaucracy. It was also a means of preserving history and culture. Carthaginian families recorded genealogies and property deeds, while religious authorities maintained detailed ritual texts to ensure the correct performance of ceremonies. Some inscriptions blended Punic language with local Berber influences, reflecting the city's diverse population. Merchants valued the alphabet as much as priests or politicians. Contracts for trade ventures were written in duplicate, one copy for the merchant, one for the port authority, detailing everything from the cargo's origin to the shares of profit. Standardized weights and measures, labeled in Punic script, ensured fair dealings in markets from Iberia to Cyrenaica. The Phoenician heritage extended beyond the practical. Symbols from the script were sometimes worn as amulets, believed to hold protective or magical power. Decorative inscriptions adorned jewelry, pottery, and even ship prose. These were not always meant to be read. Sometimes the mere presence of familiar letters invoked the prestige and protection of tradition. Education in reading and writing was primarily for the elite, though skilled scribes could rise from modest origins to positions of influence. Training began with memorizing the letters and practicing them on clay tablets before progressing to papyrus. Students learned not only the script but also arithmetic, essential for managing trade accounts. Through the Punic language and writing system, Carthage remained firmly connected to her Phoenician roots, even as she adapted to the demands of a growing empire. This continuity gave the city a sense of identity and unity, ensuring that, whether in Iberia, Sardinia, or the heart of Africa, Carthaginian traders and officials spoke with one voice, rooted in the letters of their ancestors. Carthage's political system was one of the most sophisticated in the ancient world, so much so that even Greek philosophers, including Aristotle, wrote about it with respect. Unlike monarchies or pure democracies, Carthage governed through a balanced oligarchy that combined elements of aristocratic rule, popular participation, and strict. At the top of the system were the two suffetids, chief magistrates elected annually from the city's elite families. Similar in function to Roman consuls, the suffetids presided over the council, oversaw major state decisions, and represented Carthage in diplomatic matters. Their power, however, was not absolute. They could be challenged by other governing bodies if they overstepped. The real backbone of Carthaginian governance was the Council of Elders, also called the 104, composed of influential men from the wealthiest merchant and aristocratic families. This body handled legislation, foreign policy, and oversight of military campaigns. Admission was based on wealth, reputation, and political alliances rather than hereditary right alone, allowing for merit within the upper classes. Below the council, a popular assembly existed to ratify certain decisions, particularly those affecting treaties or war declarations. Though it had limited power compared to the elites, it provided a channel for broader citizen participation and acted as a counterweight against unchecked oligarchic control. One of Carthage's most notable political innovations was its system of magistrate accountability. The 104 acted as a supreme court of oversight, ensuring that generals and officials were held responsible for their actions. A failed military campaign could lead to fines, exile, or even execution. Not as an act of vengeance, but as a safeguard against corruption and incompetence. The legal system was rooted in Phoenician tradition, with codified laws covering property rights, contracts, trade disputes, and criminal offenses. Contracts were strictly binding, often witnessed by scribes and sealed with signet rings. Maritime law was highly developed, reflecting the city's reliance on trade. Shipwrecked cargo, for example, was regulated to prevent looting, and trade monopolies were enforced by law. Religious authority was deeply intertwined with governance. Major political decisions were often accompanied by sacrifices and omens, and priests held advisory roles, particularly in matters relating to treaties and colonization. This blending of civic and sacred responsibilities reinforced the idea that the gods themselves oversaw Carthage's laws. Was designed for stability. By distributing power among multiple bodies and enforcing strict accountability, Carthage avoided the extremes of tyranny or mob rule. It was a structure that allowed the city to manage a far-reaching empire while maintaining unity at home. For Carthage, the sea was not just a boundary, It was the foundation of her empire. The navy was the shield that guarded her coasts, the sword that extended her power, and the lifeline that connected her far-flung territories. Without her fleet, Carthage's vast trade network and overseas colonies could not survive. The heart of this power was the Kothon, Carthage's magnificent double harbor. The outer, rectangular harbor served the merchant fleet, while the inner, circular naval harbor housed warships in covered docks. At its center stood the Admiral's Tower, from which orders could be relayed instantly to every ship in port. This design allowed Carthage to maintain a permanent, ready-to-sail fleet capable of rapid deployment. Carthaginian warships were primarily biremes and triremes, later supplemented by larger quadriremes. Sleek and fast, they were designed for ramming, equipped with bronze-sheathed prows capable of splintering an enemy's hull. Marines stood ready to board crippled ships, while archers and slingers rained projectiles from the decks. The fleet also included transport ships for troops, supply vessels, and specialized scouting craft. Naval crews were a mix of Punic citizens, allied sailors from Phoenician colonies, and skilled seafarers from across the Mediterranean. Training was constant. Rowers drilled in perfect synchronization, learning to maneuver the warships in tight formations. Commanders practiced complex tactics, feigned retreats, encirclements, and the devastating deckless maneuver, in which ships broke through an enemy line and attacked from the rear. The Navy's role extended beyond battle. Merchant convoys relied on escort ships to deter piracy. In times of famine or siege, the fleet transported grain from Africa or Sardinia to sustain the population. Diplomatic missions often traveled under naval protection, projecting Carthage's strength wherever they went. One of the fleet's greatest assets was its logistical efficiency. Supply ships carried spare sails, rigging, and repair materials, allowing warships to stay at sea for extended campaigns. Naval bases in Sardinia, Sicily, and Iberia served as refueling and resupply points, ensuring that Carthaginian vessels could operate far from home. 2. The navy was also a political tool. The sudden appearance of Punic warships off a rival's coast was often enough to compel concessions without a single arrow being fired. Such shows of force reinforced Carthage's dominance over smaller states and discouraged potential rebellions among subject territories. Carthage's mastery of the sea was unmatched in the Western Mediterranean for centuries. While other powers could challenge her on land, few dared face her navy in open water. This maritime supremacy allowed the new city to flourish as a commercial and military powerhouse, proving that in Carthage's world, control of the waves meant control of destiny. Though Carthage's history with the Greek world was marked by fierce rivalry, especially in Sicily, there were also moments of calculated diplomacy. The first treaties between Carthage and Greek city-states demonstrated that the Punic elite understood when to fight and when to negotiate. These agreements allowed both sides to profit from trade while avoiding costly wars. One of the earliest recorded treaties came in the late century BCE between Carthage and certain Greek colonies in southern Italy. The agreement defined clear spheres of influence. The Greeks would not interfere in Punic territories in western Sicily, Sardinia, or North Africa, while Carthage would respect Greek holdings in the eastern Mediterranean. Neutral zones were established to prevent disputes over contested islands. These treaties were often born from pragmatism. Both sides recognized that continuous conflict drained resources and disrupted commerce. For Carthage, peace meant secure trade routes for her merchant fleet. For the Greeks, it meant safe access to Punic markets, where they could exchange olive oil, wine, and fine ceramics for metals, dyes, and luxury goods. The negotiation process was as much a performance as it was a discussion. Carthaginian envoys arrived in Greek cities, dressed in flowing purple robes, carrying gifts of ivory carvings, gold jewelry, and amphorae of Tyrian purple dye. Greek diplomats returned the courtesy with fine bronze work, ornate pottery, and amphorae of rich Chian or Corinthian wine. Banquets sealed the agreements, with both sides offering toasts to their gods, Zeus and Poseidon for the Greeks, Baal Hammon and Tanit for the Carthaginians. Treaties were written in both Punic and Greek, engraved on bronze tablets or stone stelae, and kept in the temples of each city to ensure divine witness to the pact. Violation of a treaty was seen not just as a political offense, but as an act of sacrilege. Some treaties included trade privileges, reduced harbor fees for Greek merchants in Carthaginian ports, and reciprocal rights for Punic traders in Greek markets. Others outlined mutual defense clauses against common threats, such as piracy or aggressive third powers. However, these agreements were never entirely free from tension. Greek expansion into the western Mediterranean and Carthaginian involvement in Sicily often pushed the boundaries of the treaties. Still, for decades at a time, these accords provided a framework that allowed both powers to prosper without open war. The early Greek treaties reveal a vital aspect of Carthaginian statecraft: the ability to balance military strength with diplomatic finesse. By making peace where it was profitable, Carthage could focus her resources on expansion elsewhere, secure in the knowledge that her eastern flank was, at least temporarily, safe. Carthage, a crossroads of trade and culture, was not only a melting pot of goods and languages, it was also a meeting place of gods. While the Punic pantheon was rooted in Phoenician tradition, centuries of contact with Berber, Greek, Egyptian, and even Etruscan cultures created a rich tapestry of religious syncretism, the blending and adaptation of deities across traditions. At the heart of Carthage's faith remained Baal Hammon, lord of fertility and the sky, and Tanit, the protective mother goddess. Yet over time, their images and attributes began to shift. Baal Hammon, often depicted as a bearded elder with ram's horns, took on aspects of the Berber sky god, strengthening ties with local tribes. Tanit, initially a purely Phoenician figure, began to resemble Greek goddesses like Hera or Demeter in artistic depictions, reflecting the cultural exchanges brought by trade and diplomacy. Egyptian influence was visible in the adoption of Isis and Osiris into Carthaginian worship, especially among merchant families with close ties to the Nile. Temples dedicated to Tanit sometimes incorporated Egyptian lotus motifs or solar discs, while certain religious festivals echoed Egyptian ceremonial processions. Greek connections introduced parallels between Punic and Hellenic gods. Melkart, a hero god from Tyre, was often equated with the Greek Heracles, especially in colonies where Carthaginians and Greeks coexisted. This equivalence made it easier to negotiate religious understanding in treaty. Talks and facilitated trade by giving both sides shared sacred references. Such blending was not seen as sacrilegious. Rather, it was a mark of wisdom. By recognizing the divine power in foreign gods, Carthage demonstrated cultural adaptability and political savvy. In markets and ports, sailors from across the Mediterranean could find familiar symbols in Punic temples, reassuring them that their own gods were honored here. Religious syncretism also extended to rituals. Carthaginian festivals might include music styles from Iberia, dances from North Africa, and offerings of goods acquired through far-reaching trade, spices from Arabia, incense from the Levant, and precious stones from. However, this openness had its limits. Core rites to Baal, Hammon, and Tanit remained distinctively Punic, and the Council of Priests carefully preserved traditional forms of worship. Foreign elements could be incorporated, but never to the point of erasing Carthage's spiritual identity. In the end, Carthage's religious syncretism was a reflection of her place in the world, firmly rooted in her Phoenician past, yet enriched by every culture she encountered. It allowed her to bridge differences, foster trust, and weave a spiritual web across the Mediterranean that mirrored the trade routes of her empire, Tyre. Sardinia had long been a stepping stone in Carthage's maritime empire. Its position in the center of the western Mediterranean made it both a strategic naval base and a rich source of resources. By the lith and wth centuries BCE, Carthage's presence on the island had grown from scattered Phoenician outposts into a network of fortified settlements. But securing Sardinia was no simple matter. The island's rugged interior was dominated by fiercely independent Nuragic tribes, whose stone towers dotted the hills and valleys. Initially, Carthage focused on controlling the coastal zones, where harbors could shelter merchant fleets and warships. Cities such as Tharos and Souchis became Punic strongholds, complete with Kothan-style harbors, temples to Baal, Hammon, and Tanit, and warehouses stocked with Sardinian metals, grain, and timber. From these bases, Carthage extended influence inland through a mix of trade, diplomacy, and, when necessary, military force. Sardinia's copper and lead mines were among its greatest treasures. Carthaginian overseers managed mining operations, while local labor, sometimes voluntary, sometimes coerced, extracted and processed the ore. The metals were shipped back to Carthage to be used in weapon production, ship fittings, and as trade goods. Relations with the Nuragic tribes were complex. Some leaders allied with Carthage in exchange for luxury imports and military aid against rival clans. Others resisted fiercely, launching raids on Punic settlements and ambushing caravans. Carthage responded by constructing a chain of inland forts, manned by mixed garrisons of Punic infantry, Berber cavalry, and mercenaries. But these forts not only protected trade routes, but also served as centers of cultural exchange, where Punic and Nuragic goods, ideas, and even customs intermingled. Sardinia's agricultural potential was also important. Its fertile plains produced wheat, barley, and olives, while its coastal fisheries provided salted fish and shellfish for export. Punic farmers introduced advanced irrigation and crop rotation techniques, increasing yields and strengthening Carthage's food supply lines. The naval importance of Sardinia could not be overstated. From its western ports, Carthaginian fleets could patrol the Tyrrhenian Sea, intercept rival ships, and maintain direct contact with allies in Etruria. The island also acted as a shield for Carthage's western flank, ensuring that enemies could not use it as a base to strike at North Africa. By consolidating control over Sardinia, Carthage secured one of the key pillars of her empire. It was not only a resource hub and naval bastion, but also a cultural bridge between Punic civilization and the indigenous peoples of the western Mediterranean. As before Hannibal, the island stood as both a prize won through perseverance and a fortress guarding the sea lanes to Carthage's heart. In a world where trade routes spanned thousands of miles and rival powers lurked beyond every horizon, Carthage's survival depended not only on ships and armies, but on information. Long before the age of Hannibal, The city had cultivated a far-reaching web of spies and intelligence networks, quietly influencing events from Iberia to the Levant. The foundation of this system was Carthage's merchant fleet. Traders were more than simple businessmen. They were also the eyes and ears of the state. Captains and crew gathered news in foreign ports, noting shifts in politics, military preparations, and the prices of critical goods. Upon returning home, they reported to officials who compiled and analyzed their accounts. Carthaginian embassies and trading posts doubled as observation points. Envoys kept detailed records of their hosts' alliances, disputes, and economic health. In Greek cities, Punic agents might pose as merchants or interpreters, quietly sending coded messages back to the Council of Elders. In Iberia and Africa, trusted allies were paid to pass along rumors of unrest or troop movements. Messages were carried by fast couriers, mounted riders, or swift ships, often disguised as ordinary cargo deliveries. Sensitive reports were sometimes hidden inside wax tablets, with the real message scratched beneath a layer of clean wax. Other times, agents memorized key details and delivered them orally to avoid leaving evidence. Carthage also employed double agents in rival territories. Greek mercenaries hired into Punic service were sometimes tasked with returning to their homelands as deserters, while feeding misinformation to enemy commanders while reporting back to Carthage. Similarly, Punic merchants would ingratiate themselves with influential foreign leaders, subtly guiding them towards decisions favorable to Carthaginian interests. In times of war, the intelligence network became a weapon in itself. Before launching a campaign, generals consulted reports detailing enemy troop numbers, supply depots, and weak points in fortifications. Naval commanders learned which harbors were poorly defended, or when a rival's fleet was away on campaign, enabling surprise attacks. The network also served to protect Carthage's secrets. Maps of trade routes, locations of hidden anchorages, and navigational knowledge of the Atlantic coast were closely guarded. Anyone caught selling such information to rivals faced severe punishment, often execution. While Carthage rarely celebrated her spies publicly, their work was as critical as any battlefield victory. By knowing her enemy's intentions and concealing her own, Carthage could negotiate from a position of strength, avoid unnecessary wars, and strike with precision when the time was right. In the shadows of the Mediterranean, where whispers could shape the fate of cities, Carthage's intelligence network ensured that she was rarely caught unprepared, and often her rivals never knew how much she already knew. Carthage. In the ancient Mediterranean, few societies afforded women as much influence as Carthage. While they did not hold public office or serve in the military, Carthaginian women played a vital role in the city's economy, religion, and family life, sometimes wielding power that rivaled that of their male relatives. In wealthy merchant and aristocratic families, women managed estates, oversaw agricultural production, and supervised household finances, while their husbands traveled on long trading voyages. Property ownership and inheritance laws allowed women to control land, slaves, and business ventures, especially as widows or heiresses. Some even sponsored public works or temple renovations, their names inscribed alongside those of their male benefactors. Religious life gave women prominent visibility. Priestesses of Tanit, the city's great mother goddess, led processions, performed sacred dances, and oversaw rituals of fertility and protection. These ceremonies were central to Carthaginian identity, and the women who officiated them commanded deep respect. Offerings made to Tanit were often recorded in the names of women, underscoring their role as spiritual intercessors. Marriage in Carthage was both a personal union and a strategic alliance. Elite families arranged marriages to strengthen trade partnerships or political ties. While men negotiated the terms, women maintained the social bonds, hosting banquets, exchanging gifts, and ensuring the smooth operation of extended family networks. Among the working classes, women labored alongside men in fields, vineyards, and workshops. In the harbor districts, they brewed beer, wove textiles for trade, and sold goods in open-air markets. Some worked as scribes or accountants in family businesses, a testament to the city's pragmatic approach to commerce. Travelers from Greece and Rome were often struck by the freedom Carthaginian women seemed to enjoy. Aristotle himself remarked, though not without criticism, that women in Carthage had considerable influence in shaping political decisions through their connections to powerful men. This informal political voice was exercised in salons, banquets, and temple gatherings, where women could exchange news, broker introductions, and advocate for causes benefiting their families. In times of crisis, Carthaginian women could be called upon for public sacrifice, offering their wealth, their labor, and, according to some ancient accounts, even their children to secure the city's survival. Whether these more extreme claims were truth or hostile propaganda, they reinforce the image of Carthaginian women as deeply tied to the fate of the city. Ultimately, women in Carthage were more than passive figures in the background of history. They were landowners, business managers, religious leaders, and cultural patrons, threads woven deeply into the fabric of Carthaginian life. In the centuries before Hannibal, their influence helped sustain the city's prosperity, resilience, and unique identity. Carthage's military power was not built solely on numbers or brute force. It was shaped by innovation, adaptability, and a mastery of logistics that allowed her to project power across the Mediterranean. Unlike states that relied primarily on citizen soldiers, Carthage perfected the art of combining professional mercenaries, allied troops, and naval supremacy into a cohesive and flexible war machine. One of Carthage's earliest innovations was her multi-ethnic army structure. Punic citizens served mainly as officers, elite infantry, and cavalry, while the bulk of the fighting force was drawn from abroad. Iberian swordsmen, Libyan spearmen, Balearic slingers, Numidian light cavalry, and Greek or Campanian heavy infantry. This diversity brought a wide range of weapons, fighting styles, and battlefield tactics under a single command. Carthage also invested in specialized training and integration. Where mercenaries were drilled in learning to coordinate their strengths, Numidian horsemen would harass enemy flanks while Iberian infantry delivered sudden shock charges, supported by relentless missile fire from Balearic slingers. In siege warfare, Carthage adopted and improved on Greek and Phoenician techniques. Engineers constructed massive siege towers, clad in wet hides to resist fire, battering rams with iron heads, and mobile shields to protect sappers undermining walls. So, the ability to build and transport these engines quickly gave Carthage an edge in both offense and defense. The navy played a direct role in land battles. Amphibious assaults were carefully coordinated, with fleets landing troops at multiple points to overwhelm defenders. Naval artillery, catapults mounted on ships, could bombard coastal fortifications before an infantry attack. Logistics was another area where Carthage excelled. Her quartermasters maintained standardized supply systems, ensuring that armies in distant theaters received regular shipments of food, weapons, and pay. Portable field forges repaired weapons on the march, and mobile granaries stored grain in waterproof containers to keep troops fed during long campaigns. Carthage also embraced the concept of psychological warfare. War elephants, imported from North Africa, were not only powerful battlefield units, but also a terrifying sight for enemies unfamiliar with them. Trumpets, drums, and banners were used to intimidate opponents and signal complex maneuvers across the chaos of battle. Perhaps the most subtle innovation was Carthage's strategic patience. Rather than rushing into costly battles, generals were trained to wear down enemies through attrition, blockades, and economic disruption. This long-game approach required discipline, coordination between army and navy, and an ability to sustain operations for years at a time, a skill few rivals could match. While most Mediterranean powers hugged familiar coasts, Carthage looked westward, to the Atlantic Ocean, a realm of mystery and opportunity. Long before Hannibal's time, Punic merchants had ventured beyond the narrow strait the Greeks called the Pillars of Heracles. Modern Gibraltar, opening trade routes that stretched along the coasts of Iberia and North Africa, and possibly even farther. These ventures were driven by the lure of metals. The silver mines of southern Iberia were among the richest in the world, and Carthaginian ships carried the ore back to their home city in enormous quantities. Copper, tin, and gold also flowed into Punic hands, fueling both economic prosperity and political power. Vindicius, prewent Staiv, Iverost, deigned suppression. From the Atlantic coast of Morocco came exotic goods rarely seen in the Mediterranean. Ray, ivory from sub-Saharan Africa, hides from great beasts, rare woods, and even precious stones. Carthage acted as the gateway, importing these luxuries and redistributing them through her vast trading network. The most famous account of Carthage's Atlantic exploration comes from the voyage of Hanno the Navigator, who, according to ancient sources, sailed far down the West African coast with a fleet of 60 ships. His expedition established trading posts, encountered unfamiliar peoples, and brought back tales of strange animals, possibly gorillas, and lush, uncharted lands. Carthaginian sailors were skilled in navigating the Atlantic's rougher waters. They built sturdy, broad-hulled ships, capable of handling ocean swells, and their navigators read both the stars and the rhythms of the tides. Secret anchorages and fortified outposts along the Iberian and Moroccan coasts allowed them to rest, resupply, and protect valuable cargoes. These Atlantic routes were guarded as state secrets. Foreign merchants were discouraged, sometimes violently, from venturing west of the strait. Greek and Roman writers accused the Carthaginians of sinking intruding ships to keep the wealth of the Atlantic hidden from rivals. Whether exaggeration or truth, the rumor reflected Carthage's determination to maintain her monopoly. Beyond material wealth, the Atlantic trade gave Carthage a strategic advantage. Control of these routes meant control over the flow of metals essential for coinage, weapons, and luxury goods. It also provided a base from which Punic ships could strike north toward Gaul or south toward more distant African coasts. By the centuries before Hannibal, Carthage's Atlantic network was an extension of her identity, restless, opportunistic, and always reaching for the horizon. It was a reminder that while other powers fought for dominance within the Mediterranean basin, Carthage had already begun to master the seas beyond Trieste. Before the world knew the name Hannibal, Carthage had already built an empire that spanned seas, continents, and centuries. She was a city born of Phoenician daring, forged in the fires of trade and tempered by wars fought on land and sea. By the 3rd century BCE, Carthage was the dominant power of the Western Mediterranean, her influence reaching from Iberia to the Atlantic. from the sands of the Sahara to the green hills of Sicily. Her legacy was one of innovation and adaptability. Carthage had mastered the art of diplomacy, striking treaties with rivals when it served her interest, and breaking them when survival demanded it. Her navy, the envy of the known world, guarded trade routes and ensured that her merchants could bring wealth from the farthest horizons. Her army, drawn from many nations, demonstrated the value of diversity and strategic cunning in warfare. Culturally, Carthage stood as a beacon of Phoenician heritage, enriched by countless influences: Berber, Greek, Egyptian, Etruscan, and Iberian. Her religion, economy, and political institutions were testaments to her ability to blend tradition with pragmatism. Temples to Baal Hammon and Tanit rose above the harbor, while markets bustled with goods and voices from every corner of the Mediterranean. The city was not without her flaws. The same ambition that fueled her rise bred tensions with neighbors and sowed the seeds of future conflicts. Greek colonies in Sicily remained a constant point of friction, while Rome's growing influence in Italy loomed as a challenge, unlike any Carthage had faced before. The Punic reliance on mercenaries, though effective, carried risks of loyalty, and the tight grip of her oligarchic elite sometimes alienated allies and subjects. Yet in these centuries before Hannibal, Carthage's trajectory seemed unstoppable. Her harbors were full, her coffers overflowing, her alliances carefully woven. She stood not as a city waiting to be conquered, but as a force shaping the very destiny of the ancient world. The foreshadowing was there for those who could read it. The rivalry with Rome was still in its early stages, but the Mediterranean was too small for two superpowers. The coming clash would be monumental, testing every strength Carthage had built and exposing her vulnerabilities. Hannibal would one day inherit the fruits of this long history. The disciplined navy, the diverse army, the wealth of a merchant empire, and the strategic wisdom honed over centuries. But he would also inherit the enmities, the rivalries, and the geopolitical traps laid long before his birth. Before Hannibal, Carthage was already a legend. What came next would determine whether that legend would endure for all time, or be remembered as a cautionary tale of ambition, brilliance, and fate. And so we close the pages of history on Carthage before Hannibal, a city of ambition, ingenuity, and resilience. For centuries, she was more than just a rival to Rome. She was a master of the seas, a hub of commerce, a melting pot of cultures, and a keeper of traditions as old as the Phoenician dawn. Her harbors welcomed ships from distant lands, her markets overflowed with treasures, and her temples echoed with prayers to gods who watched over every voyage and every deal struck. But history is never still. The world beyond Carthage's walls was changing, new alliances forming, old enemies stirring. The seeds of future conflicts had already been sown, even as the city stood at the height of her power. Soon, a boy named Hannibal would be born into this legacy, destined to challenge the mightiest empire of his age. As we leave Carthage's golden age behind, we carry with us the lesson that greatness is built over generations, through vision, discipline, and the will to adapt. Thank you for joining me on this journey through time. Until our next voyage into history, may the winds of curiosity always guide your sails